Welcome to another session of the Aquinas Lecture Series. Our speaker today is Dr. Jason Duncan in the History Department here at Aquinas College. And Dr. Duncan has recently published this book. Here it is. And the title of the book is also the title of his talk for today, John F. Kennedy, The Spirit of Cold War Liberalism. So would you please join me in welcoming Jason Duncan?
Okay, thank you, Brent and Dan, colleagues of quality. Thanks to all of you for being here today, one and all. Well, this Friday, November 22nd, the nation marks the 50th anniversary of the death of John F. Kennedy. As it turns out, given this is the assassination anniversary, much of the focus in the media and culture, TV, is on his death. Those shocking moments in Dallas 50 years ago. The day after the, or maybe it was the day of the assassination, the Boston Globe, Kennedy's hometown newspaper, said simply, shock, disbelief, grief. They weren't reporting events, they were recording emotion. A major American newspaper in the second half of the 20th century. So, I'd like to first thank Brent and Dan for inviting me, and also the school, the college, for granting me a sabbatical fall of 2012, allowing me to do much of the writing. There was also a course release, and then at some point that helped the process and helped me to finish it. Well, just a few words on the book and me and my relationship to the memory of John F. Kennedy. I was born in January of '63. I was 10 months old with my mother in a stroller at a house drugstore down the street from her apartment when she heard the news. The Albany, New York, I grew up in, the East Coast, the capital of New York State. It's not quite fair to say it's a miniature Boston, but that's not probably fair to either city, but there are some similarities. Heavily Irish-American, heavily Catholic, strongly Democratic. Kind of old school Democrats. The party leader where I was, the chairman of the local Democratic Party, Daniel O'Connell. Chairman of the party, the most important person in the party in the county from 1920, just after World War I, to 1977. So when you were born in Albany, you were basically born a Democrat. You were born Catholic, you were born a Democrat. There were Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans. There were Jewish Americans and African Americans in the party, but the Irish were the lead group. So I grew up in the wake of these events, and hearing about Kennedy was constant. My parents admired him greatly, and the image, the legend, made him really a larger-than-life figure. So I've been reading about John F. Kennedy, thinking about him, talking about him my whole life. Kind of like a hobby, a sidelight. If I'm reading a book I have to read or I want to read, when I'm done, I pick up a Kennedy book. So just something I've sort of done naturally. I never thought, gee, I should really learn about John F. Kennedy. I just sort of grew up with his image. When I lived in Georgetown in graduate school, I had a friend who was not a Kennedy fan, and I never missed the chance to remind him his house was across the street from John F. Kennedy's house. I told him that probably every time I was over there visiting him. Now, I had the chance to write a book, a short biography for Routledge series of historical Americans. The editor initially wanted me to write a book on an early American figure, which makes sense given that we met at an early American history conference. But I thought this is my chance to write about Kennedy. So I said, it's basically JFK or nobody. He reluctantly agreed, and finally the book is published. Now, I wish I could say this was a master strategic marketing moment between me and Routledge Press to release this book just 2 weeks before the anniversary of his death. It wasn't. There's a much less noble and more mundane reason, typical to academics, unfortunately, is that I missed the first deadline by a lot. Yeah. I won't tell you when it was. Let's just say I wasn't close to it. Okay, marriage, birth of our first child, but I just missed it. Those things notwithstanding. So I got to start writing the book, the actual writing, appropriately enough, in Ireland, where I was co-director of the Aquinas program with Jennifer Dawson in 2011. Amy was visiting. We visited the JFK ancestral home. The K in that book, in my name, is Kennedy. My mother's maiden name was Kennedy. Now, she's from the Midwest, Iowa. Also grew up in an Irish Catholic Democratic family. So she gave me the name for her family, but JFK was president at the time, and that probably influenced things. I do know, I've traced my Kennedy ancestors. We came from adjoining counties in Ireland. Ours, Waterford, his, Wexford. So maybe 1,000 years ago we're related, but I'm not in the will or anything, so that doesn't get me too far. So when I had the chance to write this book, it's the old question, be careful what you wish for. And I was thrilled to have it once I got the contract. But then I thought, what do I say about Kennedy that can be fairly new? Now, this book is really designed for students, for classroom use. It includes documents. But I hope it also gets a general readership as well. The original title was John F. Kennedy, The Burdens of Cold War Liberalism. Burden was a word he used frequently. The burdens of leadership, the burden of leading the free world in the Cold War. And then I thought, that's a bit dire. That's a bit gloomy, almost. It doesn't quite capture Kennedy. So what might I replace it with? Well, Kennedy wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a policy analyst. He wasn't a particularly good legislator in terms of the technicalities of crafting legislation. But I do think he brought a certain spirit to the nation. Hence, the spirit of Cold War liberalism. Well, there's many aspects in his life and career that are fascinating. Some of the books on him are hundreds and hundreds of pages, some of them quite good. The youngest man ever elected president at the age of 43. The first, and thus far only Catholic elected, overcoming centuries of antipathy to his religion in both colonial America and the United States. I really couldn't separate Kennedy from his Irish roots or his Catholicism completely, because that wouldn't be him. That would be somebody else. But in a short book, I wanted to keep it as thematic as I could. So the theme is Cold War liberalism. The titles of the book, and that picture there's a story behind that picture. My senior editor didn't like it. She said his hand is blurry and he has a double chin. Now, at the time of that picture in October of '62, in western PA near Bob Marco's hometown of Pittsburgh, he was 45 years old. Young for a president, to be sure, but he was middle-aged, so the double chin, most of us have it, will have it. So anyway, have had it, it depends. So I got that argued, I won that argument. And then I said, I think that picture captures his energy, his vigor, or vigor, I used to say, his optimism, his strength as a leader. So I've always, I've seen that picture in books, and I thought that's the best Kennedy picture I've ever seen. So when it came time for the book cover, I had to do a fierce search on the internet, and it took me a long time to find it, but I think that captures what I'm trying to say in the book. The titles of the book are all lines, every last chapter from his inaugural address. The first, ancient heritage. He used that to reflect back on the Western, Greco-Roman, perhaps European, and even British tradition. But I gave it kind of an Irish twist in his case. I like to think works. Chapter 2, tempered by war. Remember, these are all lines from his inaugural address. Tempered by war. His experience in World War II, how it shaped him, his experience in the Navy, in the South Pacific, making him skeptical of generals and military leadership, but understanding some causes are worth fighting for. Chapter 3, a hard and bitter peace. The 1950s, the Cold War. Also, Kennedy's rise into the U.S. Senate and his emergence as a national figure in the middle part of that decade. Chapter 4, the torch is passed. The election of 1960. As Kennedy said, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century. First president born in this century, 1917, about the election between him, his bid for the nomination in the Democratic Party, and then his election victory over Richard Nixon. Chapter 5, though embattled we are, the first, basically the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, the difficulties of it, the main thing of Kennedy's presidency. Foreign policy was his great interest. That was his interest as a young congressman, in 1940, or running for Congress in 46. He wants to talk to his constituents in Boston, working class people mainly, about the Cold War, about foreign policy. They were not interested. They were interested in bread and butter economic issues. So he put that aside for the moment, but from the start of his political career, and even before that as a young man, through his death, foreign policy was his forte, his great interest. So that chapter is entitled, Though Embattled We Are. Chapter 6, Across the Globe. This refers to the Third World, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, Kennedy's efforts to reach out to peoples the United States had been unaware of for most of its history or really not particularly interested in. So Kennedy tried to align his presidency and the United States to the aspirations of these third world peoples. There's a complication. It's called Vietnam. And I deal with that in this chapter as well. That part of his policy he never got quite fixed. Much of his policy by November 63 at home and abroad was going well. Vietnam wasn't. That's an exception that his successors would deal with, much to their agony and that of the nation. Chapter 7, At Home. Those two words, he put in his inaugural address at the last minute about the domestic scene. He thought that'd be too divisive for his speech. It basically refers, in this chapter, I discuss his general domestic agenda, but the main thrust is civil rights. He doesn't run for president to deal with that issue. No other politician in either party in the 50s and up to 1960 does either. But what was called at the time the Negro Revolution was happening. Now, Kennedy, in his heart of hearts, especially in 60, would have loved that issue to go away. Most politicians would have. It was complicated. It was unprecedented. It complicated efforts to unite the Democratic Party, given the Southern white resistance to civil rights. Eventually, after a couple of years, he confronts this issue head on. Chapter 8, A Long Twilight Struggle. The assassination, at some level, the existential mystery of it, the struggle for I was reminded of Edmund Burke when I used that chapter, the hard struggle of the human race to make progress, to try to achieve justice, to try to achieve peace, to avoid war. It isn't easy. And Kennedy's death, he was referring to the Cold War when he said it, but I use it almost in a larger meaning, a general struggle of humanity, and that includes the mystery, not a whodunit mystery, but a larger, almost spiritual, existential mystery. Okay, so what do I mean specifically by the Cold War liberalism? Well, a lot of our students, and Sam Anderson is here today, my colonial revolutionary class. What year were you born, Sam, if I could ask? 1992. Okay, the Cold War ends just before your birth for the most part. So there's no real reason people of your generation would grow up with knowledge of it. So just a couple minutes to review the Cold War. In the 1830s, the great French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville said, the United States of America, which at this point is only partially expanded across the continent, and Russia, which is still under the Tsar's empire, would eventually vie for world leadership. These are two aggressive, expansionist, intelligent people who are diverse and energetic and have a huge continent in front of them, and eventually they will compete. One of the most brilliant predictions ever made. It turns out to be right. Both nations claim to be heirs to a revolution. Kennedy says in his inaugural address, we dare not forget we are heirs to that first revolution. And throughout his presidency, he does harken back to the American Revolution, which of course is quite distant from 1960, but he thinks it really helped shape the United States even in his time. The Soviet Union, which comes into existence after World War I in the early 1920s, is quite different. They reject the very idea of an American Revolution. They see it as a war of independence or a war of within the British Empire, but not a revolution, because as they see it through the lens of Marxism and Leninism, one ruling class, the American elite, replaced another ruling class, the British elite. But the American Revolution doesn't address class conflict or economic exploitation as they understand it. So the two revolutionary nations, eye each other warily in the first 15 or so years after the Soviet establishment of the Soviet Union. They become allies out of convenience and necessity during World War II. But it's fraught with suspicion, tension, and mistrust, in addition to some cooperation. The war ends with both nations' armies in Central Europe. The alliance very quickly disintegrates. The U.S. accuses the Soviets of reneging on its promise to hold free elections in Eastern Europe, lands they've liberated from the Nazis. For their part, the Soviets see the U.S. as very cruelly and arbitrarily cutting off Lend-Lease aid without a warning when the Soviets were still recovering from this devastating invasion by the Nazi armies in 1941. Well, John F. Kennedy, as a young man, supports the Cold War. He's an internationalist. He grows up with interest in world affairs. His father, who influenced him greatly, is not. Joseph P. Kennedy is an isolationist, before World War II and after. That makes him unsuitable, among other reasons, for high office. But his son, who studies at Harvard, studies international relations, international politics, and European history, and British history, more so than American history. He is very much taken with international politics. He turns his Harvard senior thesis into a book, with the help of some friends, published as Why England Slept. And as a young congressman, as I said earlier, Kennedy's real interest is the Cold War, which he supports. But his district is fiercely anti-communist and heavily Catholic. So, if anything, he's to the right of President Truman's foreign policy. He thinks that the government of the United States is not vigilant enough against communism. As a controversial politician from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy emerges in the early 50s, fellow Catholic and Republican from Wisconsin. Kennedy knows him personally and socially. His brother Bobby works for him. His father is friends with him. One of his sisters briefly dates him. And McCarthy is very popular in Kennedy's hometown among working class Catholics. At first, Kennedy tells a friend, I think McCarthy is onto something. But McCarthy quickly is exposed as irrational, irresponsible, reckless, and dishonest. And he loses a lot of support among political leaders of a responsible stripe of both parties. Well, Kennedy doesn't vote against McCarthy in the Senate. There's two reasons for that. The first vote, he's prepared to make a statement, moderate, temperate, but against him, and then vote for the resolution to censure him. At the last minute, as happens often in Washington, Senate leaders took the bill off the floor. They revisited it 6 months later, and McCarthy by this time is even more discredited. Kennedy is out of commission. He's out of the Senate for about 7 months. He's having back surgeries and recovering from them, but some of his fellow Democrats and liberals never forgave him for it. I watched the PBS show last week on the JFK on the American Experience, and they said, in passing, Kennedy ducked the McCarthy question. Well, that's not entirely fair. Now, when he returns to health, the issue was over with, McCarthy's done, and he basically says nothing about it. As his wife said, he really wasn't the type to pile on, and he doesn't really make a statement about McCarthy either way. Now, every Democratic senator voted to censure McCarthy in '54. Kennedy would certainly have joined them as well. So, short of stabbing him to death on the floor of the Senate, I'm not sure sometimes what wanted him to do, but that sort of shapes his view toward, and that's part of the story of his liberal journey, so to speak. As a young congressman, he travels the Middle East. He goes to Vietnam in the early 50s. He becomes skeptical of the French war to reimpose colonial rule. That's Kennedy at his best. He's curious, he has the means when he's healthy to travel, and he does so. As he becomes more of a national figure in the late 50s, running for president essentially, he begins to develop a critique of U.S. foreign policy. He says, we're opposing the Soviet Union, and that's fine, but we're not really doing enough to encourage the independence of other nations. And he picks on a case study, the North African people of Algeria. So it's a mild critique of the main lines of U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't attract much attention at the time, but it does show his interest in this part of the world. So in 1960, Kennedy runs for president. He's seeking to become the first Democrat to be elected since the specter of McCarthyism. He's aware of that. He runs against Nixon. Nixon's a moderate Republican. Kennedy's a moderate Democrat. They largely agree on the Cold War and on a lot of domestic issues. The parties today, in many ways, are very different than today. There's liberal Republicans, moderate conservatives in their party, moderates, liberals, conservatives in the Democratic Party. So they're both sort of in sync with the Cold War. But Kennedy runs the same sort of strategy. He runs to get elected to the Senate in Massachusetts 8 years earlier. He runs to the left of Nixon on domestic issues, with the exception of civil rights, which he kind of leaves alone for the most part. But he says, we're not doing enough. We need to make a model for the world. The Soviets are claiming they're going to bury us. They're going to win. Their system is best. They can provide for their people. They're building schools. They're building hospitals. They're educating the Soviet peoples and others. What are we doing? We're falling behind. We're falling behind in schools, healthcare, housing. He says we have too many slums, too many ghettos, not enough anti-poverty efforts. So he runs to the left of Nixon on domestic issues. And in that first debate, which is the one that got the highest ratings, Kennedy seizes the offensive on almost every issue. It's kind of a myth that Kennedy did better because he looked better and poor Nixon looked ill. That may be, but Kennedy was clearly out in front on the domestic scene. And he links it to the Cold War. We have to set a model too. It's not enough just to be against the communists. We have to show the world our system works. We can provide for our people. A free society, as this most ironic of men said without irony, has to be able to show the world, the third world, the rising nations, that we can solve our problems peacefully. We can reform ourselves, short of a revolution that Khrushchev was calling for, wars of national liberation around the world. So on the left, he runs, on the right, he runs on foreign policy to Nixon's right. Communism, he said, is festering 90 miles off the coast of Cuba. And what are the Republicans doing about it? The Soviets, that was true enough. The Soviets have gotten the lead on us in weapons. That was exaggeration or distortion. That was not true. But he also said they've got the lead on us in outer space, and that was true. The Soviets had fired the first rocket into space in 1957. And as Kennedy said, the first dog, and there was a dog on this, a Russian dog on this flight, the first dog in space wasn't named Fido or Spot. He was named Strelka, a Russian word, to make the point. Okay, everybody knows about dogs' names, and Kennedy made that point. So he's elected president. Okay, his inaugural address is what, in many ways, there's few presidents as much known for the inaugural address as his is. But I wanted to show you just a few minutes of it, a snippet, if it'll work. And God and Mark Schmidbauer on my side here. This will happen. Let's see if this goes.
To the ranks of the free, we pledge our word that one form of colonial control shall not have passed away merely to be replaced by a far more iron tyranny. We shall not always expect to find them supporting our view, but we shall always hope to find them strongly supporting their own freedom and to remember that in the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside. To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required, not because the communists may be doing it, not because we seek their votes, but because it is right.
Okay, so there it is. We need to, as Americans, be aware of the rising nations of the world, their poverty, their aspirations, to help them. Now, not just because it's right, but also because the communists had, led by the Soviets, and now the Chinese, believe that they were on the right side of history, that they spoke for the workers and the peasants, and that the United States, in the Soviet view, was an imperialist, aggressive, capitalist power. Now, Kennedy's a wealthy man. He's born into wealth. He never has to worry about money. So he doesn't question the fundamentals of the U.S. economic system at any point in his life, as far as we know, in any serious way. But he does think we're in a pretty fierce competition. It's not just military. It's ideological, it's philosophical, and we better be ready for it. And he thought in the 50s, we drifted. We were complacent. We sort of missed this rising third world that is now looking for a model, a friend, an ally, and they're most likely going to pick the Soviet Union and their model, the United States and its model. Now, when the bright sun of the great hopes he elicited on Inauguration Day quickly turned to the hard realities of governing. Kennedy's first year, he told a friend, and its end was a disaster. Okay, he could be very blunt and self-critical in private. He inherits the plan from the Eisenhower administration to support Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. Now, he doesn't really ask the hard questions of the people in charge. At his best, he would do that. He was a fairly rare politician who, in meetings, at his best, would listen intently and ask questions instead of sort of talking on and on and on about his own views. But that time, he didn't do it. He's young, he's 43. These generals are much older than him. President Eisenhower, who knows a little bit about seaborne invasions, having led the American, British, and other forces on D-Day, had given his tacit approval. Kennedy was also worried about being considered soft on communism as the first Democratic president since the McCarthy scare. So I won't say against his better judgment, but he did have some doubts about it. He gives his approval, and as one historian said, it was a perfect disaster. The anti-Cuban, anti-Castro exiles are crushed. Castro's army and grip on Cuba is seemingly stronger than ever. And the Soviets have a great propaganda piece. This is the true face of American democracy. Kennedy talks about helping the third world, helping the peasants, but look what he does. He sends in a group of thugs to overthrow the people's government. So he's off to a bad start. Later that summer, he meets with Khrushchev in Vienna. There's no real agenda on the table, and Khrushchev is aggressive personally. He's a foot shorter than Kennedy. He's not well educated as Kennedy is, seemingly. He has a son older than Kennedy, and in his view, Kennedy is a rich, Western, decadent, soft-headed playboy. And Khrushchev is aggressive and belligerent. Kennedy's not used to this. I mean, he's used to some tough politicians in Boston, but they weren't generally people with a lot of blood on their hands like Khrushchev, as part of Stalin's inner circle had. So he was a little bit stunned and taken aback. Now, he later said, Khrushchev beat the hell out of me, again, in private. But to his aides later said, well, Khrushchev was aggressive, but Kennedy gave as good as he got, maybe. A few months later, the Soviets put up what they call the anti-fascist defense wall in Berlin. We know it simply as the Berlin Wall. Kennedy's soldiers were right there in the scene, and the Soviets put it up gradually, in steps, sort of gouging American reaction. Are they going to knock it down now? Are they coming after it now? Let's see how far we can get. Kennedy let it go up. He was criticized for this. He said, better a wall in private than a war. Well, it's hard to argue with that, especially in the nuclear age. So the Soviets then feel they have a lightweight in the White House. And Khrushchev thinks Kennedy can be pushed around. So he comes up on his own, seemingly, with the plan of putting missiles in Cuba. Now, he was really taken with Castro, this valiant socialist warrior defending his little nation against the Yankee imperialist giant. If he can just put offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba, he will protect them from American invasion. His plan is to get them in, have them ready to go to the UN for a speech, and then drop in on Kennedy at the White House. And he said, he used a very down-home analogy. Khrushchev was a rural person in origin. He said, well, it's like the peasant or farmer who has to bring his goat into the hut for the winter. He doesn't like the smell at first, but he'll get used to it. Kennedy will get used to the missiles. Well, Kennedy didn't want the goat anywhere near his hut, as it turns out. And after the Soviets had assured him publicly and privately there would be no missiles in Cuba, they were in the process of deploying them. The Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Kennedy is under pressure to get the missiles out. He and his advisors agree the missiles are coming out one way or another. They're definitely coming out. He's under heavy pressure by the military to take them out with an airstrike. That would open up a lot of potential danger. The Soviets moving on Berlin, where the U.S. was committed to protecting West Berlin, among other places. Now, Kennedy eventually puts on a quarantine, as you know. Khrushchev backs away. The Soviets pull back. But it was a close call. Kennedy is shaken. Khrushchev is shaken. And Kennedy, though, is now feeling more confident about his status as commander-in-chief. The next June, after a lot of contemplation on both sides of the Cold War, he goes to American University, the commencement address, June 10th, 1963, and this is what he says in asking Americans to rethink some of their assumptions about the Cold War and the Soviet Union.
Accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break...
So, he puts it in geographic terms Americans can understand. A lot of Americans did not realize, because the Cold War emerges so quickly after World War II, how the Soviets suffered in that contest. So he takes a risk here in saying this, okay, especially as a Democrat. Now, he's against communism. He makes that clear. But in the nuclear era, an unchecked rivalry is dangerous. So he follows up on this speech. In August of '63, the United States, the Soviets, and the British negotiate a partial test ban treaty, eliminating all nuclear treaties or weapons, explosions and tests, except those conducted underground. It pulls back from the Cold War. So his Cold War liberalism, I think, is based on strength, but flexibility, as he said in his inaugural address. We should not fear to negotiate if we think we can. He learns from the lesson of Woodrow Wilson. He sends both Democrats and Republicans to Moscow to oversee the negotiation of the treaty, not just members of his own party. The Senate votes 80-19 to confirm it, to support it. to ratify the treaty. After a lot of critics said, you'll never get it passed. It's too controversial. People don't feel the trust the Soviets, especially after Cuba. You're making a big mistake. Well, for someone who supposedly couldn't get his legislative program through Congress, he got through an important step at that time. I won't have too much time to go into Vietnam, where Kennedy never got his policy in line with his philosophy. The Vietnam situation was difficult. It was on the back burner. The main problem from the U.S. perspective was there was no government in South. The government of South Vietnam seemingly failed to have the support of enough of its people. And Kennedy was frustrated by that, as will be Johnson and Nixon. He signs off on a coup which goes horribly wrong. He doesn't anticipate that President Diem and his brother will be killed. He's actually shocked when he gets the news, although a general in the room at the time said, what did he expect? So Vietnam sort of goes against the overall narrative of Kennedy growing as president. One of the great what-ifs is, what would he have done had he survived? He supposedly told a close aide after re-election in '64 he would get out. But others say there's not much evidence to support that. I do know he didn't like to lose, and I do know he was skeptical of governments that really didn't have the support of their people. Would he have avoided the tragedy of Vietnam? We don't know. Lyndon Johnson, for all his brilliance and skill, was not particularly well-traveled. He was not as well-read as Kennedy. Clearly, he was not anywhere nearly as interested in foreign policy as was Kennedy. His forte was the home front. Too bad they couldn't have worked together better as president and vice president. But in any event, that's Vietnam. The Peace Corps, anyone here, just to ask a question, has anyone here been in the Peace Corps? Okay, the day I was writing about this section of the book, I noted that some of the first volunteers went to Ghana. And that day, Amy and I brought Leo to his pediatrician for his checkup. She was from Ghana, so I mentioned the Peace Corps. She said, oh yes, we have Peace Corps volunteers in my high school. Well, Kennedy also urged the nation, and that brought home the point in a big way, also urged the nation to peacefully compete with the Soviets by going to the moon. As he said in one of his great speeches at Rice University in Houston, Texas, we choose to go to the moon, we choose to go in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because the challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, which the U.S. does put the first man on the moon, and Kennedy was pretty adamant that it'd be an American, not a Russian, and that goal was achieved. Well, as I said, Kennedy was in the 20th century liberal tradition of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, using the government, the national government, to soften the soft edges of a capitalist market economy, to provide a minimum wage. He does get the first minimum wage law enacted since the late 30s. A lot of his domestic issues, though, agenda, aid to education, what was beginning to be called Medicare, was still bottled up in Congress. And although Kennedy did introduce much of this legislation under President Johnson, it was enacted into law. Now, the big issue, as I said at the outset, was civil rights. Kennedy doesn't really reference it much in his inaugural address, but he does notice the Coast Guard delegation that goes by his reviewing stand is all white. He checks into it. The Coast Guard's never had a black student. He orders it integrated. He did a lot of his stuff behind the scenes. He gets his brother to basically persuade or pressure the owner of the Washington Redskins, and that's a story back in the news, who was basically a segregationist who had never hired a black person to play for his football team. The stadium was on federal land, and the McKenney administration said, let's see some integration with the Washington Redskins, which happens eventually. Now, those are relatively minor points. He does do some other executive orders, like eliminating segregation in public housing, but only after a delay. He appoints Thurgood Marshall, the first black federal justice at that level of the courts, but he also appoints some segregationist Southerners. He has a difficult balancing act. But increasingly, the civil rights issue was something whose time had come. In May of '63, Dr. King leads a protest in Birmingham that is technically illegal. The local police, led by Bull Connor, unleash hoses and billy clubs. There are pictures broadcast around the world of black children and teenagers being intimidated by an all-white police force. Kennedy says to an aide, these pictures make me sick to my stomach, but not just for the people being abused. The Soviets used this as propaganda. So Kennedy's liberalism is connected to the Cold War. How can we really say to the world that we stand for freedom when we deny black people equal rights? The day after his American University speech, the very next day, June 11th, he goes on national TV. He's trying to get his speech written. He actually ad-libs part of this speech because 8 o'clock, the networks gave him time, and he wasn't quite ready yet. There was some disorganization in the Kennedy administration at times. But here's his remarks about civil rights, June 11th, 1963.
But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Okay? So this is an important speech. It helps spur the Civil Rights Bill, which was passed and enacted the next year under President Johnson. So, Kennedy's death comes at a time when he's really learned the job. At home and abroad, things are moving in the direction he had set. Now, as I said, he wasn't all-knowing and always on target. Vietnam is a clear exception. He made mistakes there. He hesitated on civil rights. But I think one of the reasons he's so missed and so remembered is this successful connection of liberalism and of strength and of building up the nation, not liberalism or big government for its own purpose, but to help strengthen the nation for the Cold War competition, and overseas being strong, well-armed, but willing to negotiate if possible, willing to pull back from war, and willing to reach out to the Soviet Union. So I'll read the final paragraph from my book. There are many ways to think about John F. Kennedy. One is that he boldly stepped forward at a defining hour in the history of the Cold War, reminding his fellow citizens that their nation's revolutionary spirit was not yet spent, and rightly encouraging them to see that they have more to offer each other in the world than the mere sum of their wealth and the might of their arms. He became an unforgettable character in the American story. Thank you.